Hello.
Hi.
Hi, James.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt the earlier.
No, that would have been a little inappropriate.
I was actually planning to sit in on it, and then
yeah, you and me both. My afternoons kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
We've got a number of participants that are continuing to join us, and then I will introduce the session. We'll give everybody another couple of minutes.
Yeah.
North Korea being a hot topic for a very cold night.
Yeah. Well, as I say, it sort of fits in, between the Ottawa uprising and the Ukraine war. Right?
Yes.
But it certainly will be something that the Ukraine situation will be something that the North Koreans will be interested in to see how far Putin can push it and what the response is to that pushing.
Yes. So, James, when we start, I'll turn my camera off.
Okay.
So give you center stage. And if there are any problems, just tell me directly, or
right.
And Lucas will no doubt sort us out.
Yeah, well, if there's a problem, please interrupt me, and if I can't be heard or whatever.
I'm assuming as comments are starting to come in the chat that people can see us, and so we're all good. So I think we'll get started now. And I want to welcome everybody to this session of the Security and Intelligence Study Group of the CIC's National Capital Branch. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, the traditional territory of the Wendat and Haudenosaunee Confederacy. May we honor the Indigenous stewards of this land and grow in right relationship with all Indigenous peoples. And for some of the group, James, were with us in September when you first presented to us, and others are new to the study group, and it's great to have you back with us. You've already mentioned, of course, that rather tumultuous times, in Ukraine, to say nothing of Wellington Street and the Ambassador Bridge. But it's also important that we pay attention to the South Korean issue, which has been becoming so complicated yet again. And in the time when Western governments are somewhat distracted, one wonders what's going to happen. For the benefit of our audience, I'll introduce you, James. James is a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a former career diplomat who has spent a good deal of time in the political and economic programs, heading them up in various embassies in South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, with accreditations to Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, and North Korea. James also was 4 years at the Permanent Mission of Canada at the UN, and has continued to write extensively on North Korean issues, and is one of our foremost experts on North Korea. So, James, without any further ado, I want to turn the floor over to you, and I will just remind our participants that we will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And if you want to submit a question, please do so through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation, Valerie, and the kind introduction. And thanks very much for those of you who are joining us this evening or will be watching the recording later. And as Valerie mentioned, well, I appreciate your attention, particularly at this time between the Ottawa siege and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In thinking of a title for this presentation and thinking of North Korea and its various activities, including its involvement with cryptocurrency, I was attracted to the title Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, but that had already been taken by a Stanford University professor for a presentation earlier this month on modern intelligence techniques. So perhaps for North Korea, I might select Nukes, Rebukes, and Cyberspace. As Valerie mentioned, I have a diplomatic experience in both South Korea and North Korea, where I led 4 diplomatic delegations, and I was the head of political economic program at the Canadian Embassy in Seoul and the diplomatic liaison advisor to the US UN Command in South Korea. So I had the rather unique and somewhat surreal experience of being at US Command in Seoul on a Saturday, ground zero for North Korea at a time of high tension with North Korea. And then on Sunday, flying to Beijing and onwards to Pyongyang on a Monday to arrive at ground zero for the US. So as I say, rather unique and somewhat surreal. And since leaving Global Affairs in 2016, I've continued my engagement on North Korean and Korean Peninsula security issues as a consultant, an analyst, a speaker, contributor to think tanks, Canadian and international media, academic journals, and foreign policy forums. I've been an invited speaker and a panelist at numerous high-level conferences on North Korea. So in making my remarks today, what I wanted to do was draw upon my diplomatic experience as well as my continued engagement on North Korean issues to provide you with the latest thinking from the community of North Korean experts and watchers. I have been concerned that the Ukraine crisis has been overshadowing other potential hotspots in the world. Specifically, the 11 missiles launched in 7 test launches by North Korea in January 2022 is not getting the attention that they warrant. These included cruise, ballistic, and Hwasong-12 missiles. These have received intermittent, scattered, and limited coverage in international media. These launches were not a surprise to North Korea watchers. In a policy paper that I wrote for the Canadian Global Affairs Institute in June 2021 on the Biden administration policy to North Korea, and in remarks to this working group on September 30th last year, I predicted that there would be such missile launches unless the Biden administration took North Korea seriously and came forward with concrete proposals backed by presidential attention. That has not happened, and the missiles have flown. So there are 3 main reasons for the tests of the North Koreans. One was to test the enhanced and upgraded weapons system in order to increase military capability and preparedness. The second was to try to get on the US agenda and prod the US into substantive engagement. And the third was to be able to negotiate from a position of strength if and when negotiations resume. I would add a supplementary reason, which is basically it provides a distraction internally for the long-suffering North Korean population. So the reasons are not new. What does shift from time to time is the weight of one or the other reason at any given time. More such launches by the North Koreans should be expected in coming weeks, particularly now that the Beijing Olympics have been completed. The North Koreans will want to avoid testing during the Chinese Communist Party Congress in October 2022. So they will probably fit tests into the period between now and October 2022. So some tests may occur perhaps during the Ukraine-Russia conflict and also probably around the South Korean presidential election in March 2022. North Korea is carefully calibrating its own actions so as not to cross what they perceive to be American red lines, namely nuclear tests or ICBM launches. But this situation cannot be expected to last indefinitely. Already the launch of the Hwasong-12 missile, the last missile they launched on the 30th of January, with the capacity of reaching Guam, is a scaling up from the earlier launches. And in remarks to the party meeting in January 2022, Kim Jong-un threatened to end the moratorium on nuclear and long-range missile testing in the face of what he perceives as the U.S. disinterest in engaging in a meaningful way. You may remember that North Korea conducted its last ICBM test in November 2017, just before the commencement of the bromance of Kim with Trump. And at that time, Kim claimed that North Korea's nuclear-tipped ICBMs could reach any part of the USA. Any such launches would be for the reasons that I mentioned, and not as a prelude to an actual conflict. There is no credible assessment that North Korea is building up to launch an actual conflict by making some sort of preemptive strike. This is not a Putin surrounding Ukraine scenario. However, you can be sure that the leadership in Pyongyang is carefully watching developments in Ukraine. There is always the danger of miscalculation and overreaction from one side or the other. That's why it's important to look for an off-ramp before we reach that point. So in this regard, I would like to set out what I intend to speak about today, namely three things. First, where are we with North Korea? And are we doomed to repeat history? Two, what can we do differently? I'll look at an alternative approach and the barriers to success. And three, an interim suggestion as a prelude to negotiations. So as the noted foreign policy commentator Fareed Zakaria likes to say, let's get started. So where are we with North Korea, and are we doomed to repeat history? Basically, for the Biden administration, the issue of North Korea is one of many issues, and it's not a top-tier issue in the way it is for South Korea and North Korea itself. The issue is existential for those states in a way that is not for the US, at least for the moment. The Biden administration had said that it was taking a calibrated, practical approach to North Korea, but there's been little evidence of what that approach may entail. There's been little in the way of concrete proposals or presidential involvement. It seems like the Biden administration, seeing little opportunity for a breakthrough, is looking more to manage rather than resolve the North Korea issue, essentially carrying on the failed strategic patience policy of the Obama administration. But the US ignores North Korea at its own peril, as North Korea will not wait indefinitely for US attention and a new US approach. Failure to engage substantively with North Korea will probably result in another provocation cycle, coinciding with the continued enlargement of North Korea's nuclear and missile capacities. A major North Korean provocation would be a major test for the Biden administration and the new South Korean government following the presidential election in March 2022. And the provocation itself and the US response would almost certainly change the dynamic in the region for the worse. There is a small window of opportunity to act before we move from prelude to an actual provocation cycle. And as I say, North Korea cannot be relied upon to wait indefinitely for a substantive US approach before upping the ante. The principal states involved, USA, South Korea, North Korea, plus China, have different objectives, and that is a problem. The US seeks denuclearization of North Korea, while South Korea has laid greater stress on détente and eventual reunification. Meanwhile, North Korea has consistently pursued its main objective of regime survival, and it considers its nuclear arsenal essential for that. For its part, China considers regional stability, including Korean Peninsula stability, to be more important than North Korean denuclearization. So there's a logjam of positions by concerned states. And unless one or the other states shifts its position, there is little room for productive negotiations. At present, such negotiations are unlikely. The US is preoccupied with Ukraine and Russia, China and Taiwan, and the Iran agreement. There is little US presidential bandwidth left to deal with North Korea. North Korea itself is preoccupied with both its economic situation and its COVID defenses. It has little time for what it considers would be a fruitless discussion with the US without a significant shift in the US approach. For its part, South Korea will have a new president after the March election. Not only will President Moon Jae-in, who has played such an important leading role in attempting to bridge the chasm with North Korea, he'll be gone, but his successor, even if he comes from the same political family, which is not guaranteed, will need time to review and decide on future policy. If the new president comes from the right-wing opposition, South Korean policy regarding North Korea may take a drastically different course. So in these circumstances, with neither the will to seek a resolution, nor channels of communication, and with political uncertainty, progress is unlikely, which is too bad because we have to remember that there are high stakes involved. At a recent expert panel in Seoul on North Korea that I was invited to attend as a panelist, another panelist said that peacefully resolving the nuclear issue with North Korea is an issue that affects all countries, especially those in Northeast Asia. Thus, by definition, it is an issue that immediately impacts South Korea, given the destabilizing effect of a nuclear North Korea. This panelist went on to say that a nuclear North Korea will destabilize the region and could incite a regional nuclear arms race with countries like South Korea and Japan seeking their own nuclear weapons capabilities. Other countries that would be impacted by nuclear North Korea include China and Russia. Beyond Northeast Asia, a nuclear North Korea also poses, with ballistic missiles that can reach as far as the US, is a global threat affecting the US and other countries. There is also the risk of proliferation to rogue states and terrorists. So all that could be true, but it is not as if we have a choice between a non-nuclear North Korea and a nuclear North Korea. The inconvenient truth is that North Korea is already a de facto nuclear state and has no intention of denuclearizing. Moreover, it continues to enhance its nuclear and missile capability. A diplomatic impasse will lead to military buildup and further tension. North Korea is the ultimate national security state. And in this ultimate national security state, regime survival is the top North Korean priority. And the regime views nuclear weapons as essential for regime survival. Hence, the overwhelming view among North Korea experts and watchers, including in the US intelligence community, and of both hawks and those who favor engagement, is that North Korea has no intention of relinquishing its nuclear weapons. There may have been a time when Kim Jong-un's father and his grandfather may have considered using nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip, but those days are long gone. For even those who hold out a faint hope for denuclearization in some unspecified and distant future are vague and unconvincing as to how this might occur. In any way, do not see this occurring in short or medium term. In fact, any such very unlikely denuclearization, if it was ever to occur, would be so far in the future that it would disappear over the horizon of foreseeable time, meaning that for all intents and purposes, even denuclearization hawks acknowledge the need to deal in the here and now with the reality of a de facto nuclear North Korea that will not negotiate away its nuclear arsenal. The former US Defense Secretary, William Perry, once said, the United States must deal with North Korea as it is rather than as the US would wish it to be. The end of quote. Now, North Korea, as it is a de facto nuclear state. So demanding the total denuclearization of North Korea in exchange for easing of sanctions is a non-starter. The regime is not about to relinquish its crown jewels. This should not be surprising to anyone. Would anyone expect Vladimir Putin to relinquish Russian nuclear arms now, ever? Of course not. Nor would anyone expect the USA, China, India, Pakistan to do so. Vladimir Putin, who occasionally makes pithy observations, famously said that North Koreans would rather eat grass than give up their nuclear weapons. And in fact, as arduous as North Korea's present situation is, it was far worse in the 1990s with wide-scale famines after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And even then, North Korea did not relinquish its nuclear ambitions. Yet US policy and international policy is based on the opposite premise, that North Korea can be pressured or cajoled into relinquishing its nuclear arms. That's what one hears from US officials and officials from like-minded states, including Canada. Such languages and hopes are jarringly at odds with the view of experts, including former officials now outside government, and to be honest, often does not accord with the private view of current officials, most informed regarding North Korea, though they will go on mouthing the official lines. The reality is that policy which requires the complete North Korean denuclearization before any progress on every other front is unrealistic and will inevitably lead to enhanced North Korean and missile capability. That's been the pattern for years through successive American administrations. There's a need to break this cycle. I would also add that in testimony to the US Congress in 2017, the US military advised that as a result of the estimated 6,000 to 8,000 underground facilities in North Korea, the only way in which North Korea's nuclear weapons could be completely located and destroyed would be through a ground invasion. Such an invasion, of course, would entail multiple risks, including Chinese intervention. North Korea's threat capacity, of course, is not limited to its nuclear capability. I will not go into detail here, but just say that North Korea has extensive expertise in conventional missiles, which are located just north of the DMZ, special forces, and cyber. It is also believed to have chemical and biological weapons. Historically, pressure does not work against North Korea. The greatest advance of North Korea's nuclear and missile capability occurred between 2012 and 2018, when US policy was variously strategic patience under Obama, which actually meant diplomatic inaction and sanctions, and diplomatic isolation and sanctions, and maximum pressure and sanctions under Trump. The main tool that the US and its allies have used to pressure North Korea are sanctions. Sanctions have imposed enormous hardship on the most vulnerable parts of the North Korean population, impeded humanitarian agencies, including UN agencies, in their work, and damaged the economy. But sanctions have not done the one thing they were set up to do: persuade North Korea to denuclearize. Sanctions have been a complete failure in this regard. Instead, North Korea has doubled down on its nuclear and missile program. In part, this is due to the fact that North Koreans have a back door to evade sanctions, namely China. But the China option is just one part of the massive and ingenious ways the North Koreans have devised to evade sanctions. Plus, North Korea has shown an amazing ability to absorb punishment without yielding. In locking down its own borders due to fear of COVID, North Korea has caused more damage and dislocation to its own economy than sanctions ever did. And by doing so, it has demonstrated it is willing to live with hardship indefinitely to protect what it perceives to be its security needs. Even US policy hawks have grudgingly accepted that sanctions have not been effective in slowing the nuclear and missile program. but many are still determined to maintain sanctions to punish North Korea and ensure that it is not rewarded for bad behavior. However, other policy hawks, including former senior U.S. policy makers and former senior U.S. intelligence officials, have shifted to supporting action for action with North Korea. For example, a lifting of some sanctions in exchange for a continuation of North Korea's moratorium on nuclear testing and long-range missile launches. The bottom line is that a nuclear North Korea poses a danger to regional and global security, but it is already a de facto nuclear state intent on maintaining that status and successfully resistant to outside pressure. Therein lies the dilemma. So do we continue to do what we've been doing with the unrealistic expectation that somehow this time the results will be different, or do we look for another path forward? So this is where we are. What can we do differently? So we look at an alternative approach and the barriers to success with this approach. So an alternative to the false hopes of denuclearization and the vicious cycle of isolation, provocation, confrontation, exchange of threats, sanctions, and nuclear and missile enhancement could be engagement, confidence building measures, and tension reductions. This would be an attempt to essentially shift the paradigm. Some American experts argue that the US needs to shift away from the worst case threat perception approach and as the stronger party start thinking about taking some diplomatic risk and engage in what they refer to as aggressive peace building. Key to this approach is determining what North Korea actually wants from the US, if that is something the US can deliver, and what the US should seek in return. For example, some experts argue that North Korea seeks removal of sanctions, confidence building measures, and respect, i.e., for instance, respect in the form of a letter or some form of communication from the President of the United States. Other former senior US officials have suggested US COVID vaccines to North Korea. Rolling back sanctions would help ease economic and livelihood hardships in North Korea and arguably improve conditions for political discussions concerning security issues. So in the absence of complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization, CVID, which is the official US mantra and extremely unlikely for the foreseeable future, there is a need to move forward on other fronts and to explore the degree to which North Korea may be prepared to do other things, such as freeze nuclear and missile development, enrichment activity, and testing of new weapons, and even eliminate parts of its existing stockpile in return for the right terms, notably significant easing and/or elimination of sanctions. One way to approach this would be a dual-track approach to negotiations, dividing up issues into two tracks, denuclearization on the one hand and peace and security issues on the other hand, rather than having a focus on a single denuclearization track, as is the case with the US right now. This would also involve working out a roadmap for phased and synchronized actions to identify specific, interlinked, and mutually reinforcing steps, which will be taken in sequence, starting with the easier ones and monitored in a way agreed to by the parties. So in taking an approach like that could encompass North Korea's non-nuclear capability, the Biden administration could seek to address a range of issues, including peace and security, peace agreement declaration formally ending the Korean War, de-escalation, arms control, weapons reduction, conventional arms negotiations, cybersecurity, humanitarian assistance, human rights, easing of sanctions, and confidence building measures. South Korea and the US's other allies would support such an approach, and it would likely gain the support of China, Russia, and other states. what needs to happen is an incremental approach. A successful strategy must set out clear benchmarks for North Korea to meet and make clear that the US and South Korea will reciprocate the positive and measurable actions with their own positive, proportional, and measured actions. The US needs to go into this with eyes wide open and the realization that the odds are against success, at least for now, but it could sow the seeds for future success. There are two main problems with this approach, basically the US and North Korea. The approach would require a shift in US policy and a level of presidential attention which the US does not seem able to give now. Plus, even if the US was willing, it takes two to tango, and North Korea may not be a willing dance partner now. North Korea has profound security issues. And when it is insecure, it is even harder to engage and even less likely to move forward on negotiations. The fundamental problem is that North Korea's central concern is the survival of the North Korean regime and the Kim dynasty, essentially a security concern. And North Korea's profound paranoia and distrust of the international community mean that it is almost impossible for the US or any external actor to provide the sort of assurance in any negotiating framework that would satisfy the regime. In addition, as the regime, and particularly the leader of the regime, has regarded former US President Trump as an opportunity and thinks long-term, Pyongyang might believe that a Republican victory in 2024 would give North Korea a second kick at the can, a second chance to reach an agreement with Trump. The North Korea might therefore be inclined to wait until 2025 before re-engaging with the USA. Moreover, North Korea is currently focused on its own economic situation and containing COVID inside the country. And for the time being, hardliners are shaping the country's policy in North Korea. These hardliners will not be enticed by economic incentives. Only once North Korea's moderates, relatively speaking, usually in the form of economic planners, regain some control will Pyongyang again move towards economic reform, opening, and negotiations. So caught between a stalemate and an unwillingness to consider a new approach, there is a proposal by South Korean President Moon on the table as an interim measure, which if successful could be a prelude to further negotiations. We could call it engagement light. That's a proposal for an agreement on an end of war declaration. Such a declaration would be mainly symbolic, but could be important as a confidence building measure. This is something that President Moon has been championing with limited uptake up to now. Its significance would depend on the details and the substance, whether it has full alliance endorsement, and whether it is packaged with other measures or as a standalone declaration. An end of war declaration could demonstrate that South Korea would like to break the cycle of mistrust. It would be a powerful gesture to North Korea that the US and South Korea want to end this war after 69 years and turn to peace and reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. It could encourage the North to return to negotiations given the goodwill it would convey. Involving all concerned parties, including China, in reaching the final text of a declaration would itself be a confidence-building measure. If a declaration could be accepted by all concerned parties, this could be the first and crucial step towards the goal of the establishment of a peace mechanism. So as I say, it's a South Korea proposal. And while South Korea is keen on such a declaration, the US position has been described as variously lukewarm, inactive, or politely disinterested. China, for its part, actually actively supports an end of war declaration. North Korea's position on an end of war declaration is unclear and ambiguous. It may make its support conditional upon other measures. The US and South Korea would have to resist, in particular, any demand that US troops be withdrawn as a result of an end of war declaration. The current security architecture in South Korea was established by the UN Security Council and must be maintained until there is replacement architecture. So there we have it. If I was a betting person, I would say the odds for the moment favor a continued stalemate with a continued enhancement of North Korean missile and nuclear capability and an eventual moment of crisis with the US followed by intense negotiations to step away from confrontation. There is an outside chance of an end of war declaration if President Moon's successor continues his advocacy for this. In that case, it could lead to more substantive discussions and lower the temperature. The more imaginative approach, the alternative to the approach that the US has taken up to now, the more imaginative approach will probably have to wait until US attention and South Korean and North Korean interests in politics align. But I think it does provide a sort of roadmap for what could be in the future. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That's it's all very interesting, and it certainly. And I'll remind our audience that you submit questions through the Q&A, and we can discuss all sorts of issues. While people are thinking of questions, a couple that I might put to you is: do we know how much the how much sway the Chinese have over South Korean or North Korean affairs at the moment?
Well, I would say that the relationship with China and North Korea is clearly complex, but it is a relationship of influence rather than command and control. And certainly the North Koreans are very sensitive to Chinese sensitivities, hence the restraint exercised during the Olympics and the restraint that they will be expected to do during the Party Congress in October by China. So they're aware and they're sensitive to Chinese sensitivities, and they're influenced by China, but they certainly don't take their orders from China. However, China has been very important as this backdoor in regards to sanctions enforcement, very important as a platform for a lot of Chinese or a lot of North Korean economic activities, including trading companies and cyber companies and various sorts. So they're an important country to North Korea. Obviously, North Korea is the most important ally. There's an interesting book that's called Empire and Righteous Nation, and it's written by a Yale University professor. It just came out in the 600 years of relations between China and Korea. And it talks about during those 600 years as the smaller country, how Korean elites had to be very sensitive and aware of Chinese sensitivities. And I think you see that same awareness today in both North Korea and in South Korea. So the sort of tradition continues.
Well, question to put in here, what is your view on South Korea's LSAM system, which is a defensive system, or will be when it comes online in 2026? And does it make a difference in the ballistic missile stuff from North Korea?
Well, I think that the thing with South Korea is that it always lives under a threat from North Korea. So 54 kilometers north of Seoul, is the DMZ, and in the mountains north of the DMZ, there are a whole raft of thousands of missiles, rockets, etc., conventional weapons. And so the South has always needed to have a defense against this, but there's no doubt that if there was a conflict, there would be immense devastation in the South. Eventually, the South and the Americans would prevail, but there is no defense system that would protect the South from having quite significant casualties.
The other question here is relating to the cryptocurrency and the lack of global regulatory controls and the North Korean attempts to steal digital currencies to fund its nuclear weapons and missile programs. This was an issue of great immediacy when we talked in September, because it was, if I recall rightly, an American had just been charged with espionage in the days before you spoke. Where does that stand now?
Well, I think that a lot of what we know about North Korean activities on cryptocurrency is actually from the Justice Department pursuit of various offenders in the U.S. who were tied in one way or the other with North Korean cryptocurrency activities. And in fact, as I think I recall that in that discussion, I think Justice Department referred to some of the players in that as bank robbers with a keyboard, basically. So those cases continue, and the amounts are quite wide. I mean, it's not only cryptocurrency, but it's also other cyber crimes that the North Koreans have been involved in. One of the UN reports talked about $316 million between 2019 and November 2020 from hackers. North Korea has an army of cyber hackers who attack both cryptocurrency wallets, but also other financial institutions that have weak defenses. And so that goes back into this question of how does North Korea manage to fund their own weapons program? And they've been ingenious over the years, and one of the ways is now, more recently, has been cyber, but more generally hacking into financial institutions, and then a whole raft of illegal trading or trading companies that are up to illegal activities in various successful ways to evade sanctions.
We've talked largely this evening about what the Americans can do in this part of the world, or what the Americans are not doing, depending on how one wants to look at it. What is Canada doing at the moment? North Korea rarely appears a mention of it in the Canadian press, whether in print media or in interviews or anything. Can you comment on that, James, of where we think we're at?
Yeah, so I think that Canada has had a limited role over several years. For one thing, because we lack representation in Pyongyang, and Pyongyang lacks representation in Ottawa. So one of the important things would be to renew the diplomatic presence periodically by the Canadian ambassador in Seoul, who until 2010 would pay regular visits to North Korea. That was stopped in 2010 because of a bilateral issue between Canada and North Korea. And at the same time, the North Korean rep in New York, who used to be accredited to Canada, also stopped making his visits. So that's a very important way, because it's important that we have eyes on the ground in in North Korea and can make our own assessments of the situation there. And that's why I was I found it very important when I went in 2015 and 2016, and that immediately raised Canada's credibility with our allies, both South Korea and with the Americans and with our like-minded. So if we really want to have an impact on events on the peninsula, we have to be present. We have to be there. We have to be in the game. We have to put resources into it. This doesn't mean opening an embassy in Pyongyang, which several EU countries, for instance, have, but it does involve making regular visits at ambassadorial level from Seoul, and I think trying to influence policy, international policy in this regard, working with, for instance, the South Koreans in assisting them in perhaps a more creative approach to dealing with North Korea than has been evident from our U.S. friends.
So you just mentioned you're working with South Korea. What about working with the U.S. to try and influence U.S. policy? I suspect I know the answer to that already, is that we have to put our money where our mouth is in general in dealing with North Korea from the Canadian perspective.
I think that, of course we have to work with the U.S., and we do work with the U.S., but the problem is that I think we have to be more imaginative in our with them and in our exchanges with them. It doesn't serve us and it doesn't serve them to be in lockstep with policy that is not working. That's why I mentioned South Korea, because South Korea, under the current president, has been out in front in trying to come up with creative ways to unblock the impasse. And that's why I think that South Korea in turn has been trying to persuade the Americans, and so we could do a service by assisting South Korea in those representations to the Americans. But one of the things that I find is that unfortunately, for one reason or the other, there is a tendency just to retreat to the policy lines that have always been, or that have been there for a long time, and just repeat them rather than try to think creatively of that has not worked. So what could we do differently that works? And I think that's one of the reasons why I think that it's important in kind of policy discussions to have an exchange which involves not just officials on the one hand and not just non-officials on the other hand, but to have real exchange of views and a discussion of ideas. And for instance, there's a Peninsula Security Conference, which I was invited to attend in December, and it was put on by the Global Affairs Canada and the South Korean Embassy and the American Embassy here. And it not only had officials, but it had people from civil society, outside experts and whatnot. And that is a sort of important to have these sort of discussions and come up with new ideas or test out new ideas. And that's one of the contributions Canada can make, to provide a platform for these sort of discussions. That and this particular one included just trilateral and South Korea, Canada, and the United States, but it would be very useful to broaden those out and have people from China and Russia and South Korea and Japan at these sort of discussions. And Canada could provide a platform for that.
Right. And yes, interesting. Yes. And what about other countries from the region? I mean, does one ever hear anything about what Australia or Japan has to think of about the Korean situation?
Well, yes, Japan, of course, is very concerned about the Korean Peninsula situation and North Korea. Japan during the Trump administration felt a sense of marginalization, that they were being kept out of the loop by the U.S. But Japan has a particular angle with North Korea. Its number one priority are the missing and abducted Japanese citizens, mainly young people at the time, who were abducted by North Koreans in the late 70s and 80s. And there's been, and this is a huge issue in Japan for the Japanese public and hence for the Japanese government. So it would be difficult for the Japanese to sort of resolve or try to play a productive role vis-a-vis North Korea without getting a resolution of the missing and abducted citizens issue. And also the other thing is that, of course, Japan, as you know, has a has an historical, there's an historical situation because of the colonial, stemming from the colonial experience on the Korean Peninsula. So Japan is not looked with particular favor, not looked upon with particular favor by either South Koreans or North Korea, for that matter. I mean, there's a lot of historical baggage there, but it remains one of the, it remains a key goal of the United States to have Japan and Korea, who are of course the American main allies in the region, working together. But of course, more often than not, what you find is controversy and disputes between South Korea and Japan because of the historical heritage, and so that limits how, what role Japan can really play in kind of in that regard. I would say Australia, I mean, it's more like in a sense more like Canada, where we're sort of involved, but involved at a distance. But they actually have had accredited ambassadors from South Korea going on a regular basis to North Korea, as has other countries such as New Zealand and other like-minded states. So it's important that Canada play that role as well.
So did I understand you correctly that the Canadian ambassador has not had a accreditation or visits to the North in over a decade?
Right, since 2010. So 2010 was the last visit, and there was a dispute stemming during the Harper government, as a reaction to the sinking of the South Korean naval ship and the loss of life, the serious loss of life. This was put on as a measure against North Korea, but frankly, the only people that are harmed by this is Canada. This doesn't, the North Koreans would like to have us there or participate, but it's not a burden on them. But it is a burden on us because we don't have eyes on the ground. We're dependent on other countries for assessments and for information. But yeah, we haven't. That occurred in 2010, and it hasn't been, and this is now 2022, and a different government with a different party here, and yet the situation continues. It's the forces. It's kind of the forces of inertia, in a sense. Somewhat the same reason why our policy is in lockstep with the United States, but doesn't seem to show much creativity. It's easier to go along with the familiar channel, but I think we need more than that. Because sooner rather than later, this situation is going to become very serious, and then people in the United States and other countries will react kind of in a knee-jerk fashion, and things escalate from there. So we need to think about this now.
That's a good segue into the question that one of our participants has put in the Q&A, that what if the North Koreans continue with their testing, what effect is that going to have for Russia and China? And are they likely to, and to read from here, to get on board with expressing concern and gaining more interested parties with changing the position or forcing North Korea into coming to the bargaining table or whatever it takes?
Yeah, I think so. China, they're interested in denuclearization, but they're more interested in stability of the Korean Peninsula, stability of the region, and that trumps for them their concerns about denuclearization. And so I think that China becomes more engaged, but not in the sense of putting more pressure on North Korea in regards to denuclearization. It's more engaged in regards to sanctions. There are pressures by the Russians and by the Chinese to relieve the sanctions, to amend them at the UN and so on. So I think that's the sort of pressure you'll get. I think that China would be of assistance in this alternative approach that I described, where when we talk about arms control, when we talk about limitations to North Korea's nuclear arsenal, when we talk about freezing, enrichment, stopping more tests, in that sense, China could be an ally vis-a-vis the United States in doing that, if the United States was to put something on the table, i.e., to do that, what's the reciprocal thing, which is the relief or at least the easing of sanctions. But problem is, if the United States doesn't come with anything on the table, then there's nothing to negotiate. I would also add about China that I was participating a couple of weeks ago in a conference on China and the Korean Peninsula, and in the context of the great America-China rivalry and face-off in Asia, to some extent there was some talk that now China has been considering North Korea to be kind of a liability in the past, because they never were sure about what North Korea would get up to. But in the context of the great America-China rivalry, there's some thought that North Korea, in China, there's some views in some circles that is now viewed as more of a strategic asset rather than a strategic liability. So that's sort of a shift, because up to now, or at least until recently, North Korea was kind of tolerated by the Chinese, but who were often annoyed at North Korean activities. But things have changed in Asia as a whole, and their relationship may be changing as well.
Do we know how much influence China actually has on the regime in North Korea?
Well, I think the only people that know that is the Chinese. I mean, it's just thought that they have a certain amount of they're an important influencer, but as I said, they certainly don't have command and control. And I think the Chinese also spend a lot of time. They know a lot more about the leadership, of course, than anybody else, and they spend a lot of time cultivating their connections. But they have a great influence, but it's not command and control.
True. The one question here is, what do you think any US-led negotiating partners would be prepared to give North Korea in return for a moratorium on ballistic missile testing?
Well, the first aim of the North Koreans would be sanctions. right? Would be relief in sanctions. Now there are UN sanctions, and then there are country-specific sanctions. Ironically, it may be easier for the easing of UN sanctions than for country-specific sanctions, because in the American case, they go through Congress, and it would be difficult to get Congress to ease up. But on the UN sanctions, there could be relief in the sense of in the Security Council. The Security Council could take a vote. The United States, if they do not vote no, then under kind of Russian and Chinese leadership in this regard, sanctions could be eased.
I have one final question here for you, is that Kim Jong-un has been appearing, disappearing, reappearing in various guises over the past, I guess really over the past year. What is likely to happen? I mean, this is speculation, obviously. Is there any evidence of a succession plan with the regime that you've been able to discern? And do you think any possible successor is going to be less hardline than the current leaders of the regime?
Well, to answer your last point, I wouldn't think so. The regime is the regime. I don't expect any lessening, any significant change in policy if Kim Jong-un was to disappear tomorrow. I think the first thing would be if something was to happen to him. First of all, the international community would be the last to know, because there would be this radio silence for a long time until they came up with their lines, and so it would be kept closely guarded. I think that we get the first indication of the makeup of the leadership group at the funeral of the former leader, as we did with his father, and who were the honorary pallbearers, who were the people that were surrounded the late leader. However, that can be misleading too, because most of those people who surrounded Kim Jong-un's father and who were thought to be his kind of godfathers were disposed of him in one way or the other. Some sooner, some later, but basically all gone. There's no evident line of succession. I think that a likely scenario in the short term would be some sort of collective leadership with one or more members of the Kim family in sort of this, prominent in that role. And I mean, given the importance of the Kim family and given the importance of bloodlines, it's actually inconceivable that some member of the Kim family would not be involved. There is Kim Jong-un's sister, who of course is a noted confidant and plays an important role in the state. However, her rise, I mean, one of the reasons why presumably why she's trusted by Kim Jong-un is because she's not seen by him to be a threat for various reasons. And I think that any rise by her would also face resistance by a lot of the older and senior and male kind of military and party establishment. They may find another Kim more palatable. Actually, Kim Jong-un has an uncle who's a career diplomat, and he retired some years ago. He's about 67, and he's a half brother of former leader Kim Jong-il, and he returned after retiring from the diplomatic service, and he's there in Pyongyang. So he may be an interesting face of sort of a regime. As I say, as I said at the beginning, I don't think that this would change the kind of they would deviate from they certainly wouldn't deviate from the nuclear path, and I think that at some point, irregardless of what happens to Kim Jong-un, you know, there are shifts in the leadership. Sometimes the military sense is given a higher emphasis. Sometimes it's economic. So I think that at some point there'll be a shift and of thinking or from the dominant group, and at that point perhaps they may be open to some of these, you know, alternative approaches.
Right. Interesting times, as
Yes.
as we say.
Yes.
Not just from what's going on in the Ukraine, but it's as you know, you've demonstrated ably as again tonight. It is important to pay attention to what's going on elsewhere in the world. North Korea should be constantly on the agenda with discussions with Canada and the U.S., Canada and the United Nations, and so on and so forth. And one hopes that somewhere over in global affairs, somebody is paying attention to these issues. So, James, I want to thank you for agreeing to come and speak again to the group. This has been very interesting and very informative. And I want to remind the membership of that there are 2 more events that are being scheduled at the moment. We'll hopefully have dates for you by the beginning of next week. First of all, hoping towards the end of March to have a session on the funding of terrorism, including domestic terrorism, and whether in defining what terrorism actually is in terms of the insurrection that was happening in Ottawa and elsewhere, which is spurned that sort of issue. And then secondly, in April or May, we'll be having a session on intelligence and climate change. So James, it just remains for me to say thank you once again. And it's been very interesting. And on behalf of the participants, you know, again, thank you. And maybe we'll have a 3rd session, and after the South Korean elections, when we know what's going to happen, and once we get some attention to other than Korea and Wellington Street. So thank you to everybody who participated tonight as well, and thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Okay.